What if the worst moment of your life became the doorway to everything you'd ever hoped for? That's what happened to Clara Martinez on a rainy Thursday night in November. Standing alone in the kitchen of Romano's fine dining, tears sliding down her cheeks as she ate cold pasta from a guest's unfinished plate. She hadn't planned for anyone to see her like this, hungry, desperate, ashamed. The restaurant had closed an hour ago, and she thought she was alone. But she wasn't. Behind her, reflected in the darkened window above the sink, stood a man in an expensive charcoal suit, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He said nothing at first, just stood there in the doorway, his presence filling the room like a sudden storm. Clara's hands froze, the fork halfway to her mouth. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd just been caught by the owner himself. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Clara had been working at Romano's for 8 months, ever since her husband Daniel had the accident that left him unable to work. The restaurant sat in the wealthy part of town, the kind of place where people spent more on a single meal than Clara made in a week. She didn't mind the work, the long hours on her feet, the demanding customers, the way her lower back ached by the end of each shift. What she minded was the constant gnawing hunger that had become her companion, the way her daughter Emma's school uniform was getting too small, the stack of medical bills on their kitchen counter that seemed to grow taller each week. She was good at her job, though. The other servers liked her. The chef, a temperamental man named Paulo, had even started saving the nicer leftover bread for her to take home. Nobody knew just how bad things were, how she and Daniel were 3 months behind on rent, how they'd started rationing Emma's insulin to make it last longer, how Clara herself hadn't had a proper meal in 2 weeks. Pride, her mother used to say, was the Martinez family curse. Clara wore hers like armor, smiling through every shift, never complaining, never asking for help. The owner, Richard Ashford, rarely came to the restaurant. He had 12 of them scattered across the country, part of an empire built by his grandfather. When he did visit, it was usually during service, dressed impeccably, observing from a corner table with those sharp gray eyes that seemed to calculate the value of everything they touched. The staff whispered about him his wealth, his ruthlessness. In business, the way he'd turned down 3 marriages to women who wanted his money. He seemed cold to Clara, the kind of man who'd never understand what it meant to choose between feeding your child and paying for heat. That Thursday night, Clara had stayed late to finish closing duties. Her shift had ended at 10, but she'd volunteered to help Paulo deep clean the kitchen for an extra $20. Every bit helped. By midnight, Paulo had left and Clara was alone, wiping down the stainless steel surfaces until they gleamed. That's when she saw it, a full plate of linguine carbonara, barely touched, sitting on the pass. The guest had ordered it, taken 3 bites, and sent it back saying it was too salty. Paulo had tasted it himself, declared it perfect, and left it there in frustration. Clara stared at that plate for a long time. The pasta glistened with cream sauce, specks of black pepper visible in the light. Her stomach cramped painfully. She'd had coffee for breakfast, nothing for lunch, and the small apple she'd saved for dinner had gone to Emma. The logical part of her brain said to throw it away, to maintain her dignity, to go home. But the desperate part, the part that had been growing stronger each day, reached for the plate with shaking hands. She didn't even bother heating it up. Just stood at the counter, fork in hand, eating cold pasta in the empty kitchen while rain hammered against the windows. Each bite tasted like defeat, but she couldn't stop. She was so focused on the food, so lost in her own humiliation, that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching down the hallway, didn't hear the door ease open, didn't realize she wasn't alone until she caught that reflection in the window, a man's silhouette. Watching her, Clara spun around, the fork clattering onto the counter. Richard Ashford stood in the doorway still, wearing his suit from some event, his tie loosened at the collar. He must have come in through the private entrance, the one that led directly to his office upstairs. For a terrible moment, neither of them spoke. Clara's face burned with shame. She wanted to explain, to defend herself, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she possibly say? That she was so poor, so desperate, that she was eating garbage like a stray dog? "I'm sorry," she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll pay for it." Richard held up his hand, silencing her. He walked further into the kitchen, his expensive shoes clicking on the tile floor, and Clara noticed something unexpected in his expression. Not anger, not disgust. Something softer, almost like recognition. He stopped a few feet away from her, close enough that she could see the weariness in his face, the shadows under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept well in some time. "How long?" he asked quietly. What do you mean? How long have you been this hungry?" The question, asked so gently, nearly broke her. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, and she hated herself for it. "It doesn't matter," she said, lifting her chin. "I'll leave. You won't see me here again." "Wait," Richard said, and something in his voice made her pause. "Please, just wait." Richard moved past Clara to the industrial refrigerator, pulled out eggs, butter, and a container of fresh herbs. Clara watched in confusion as he rolled up his sleeves and turned on one of the burners. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making you a proper meal," he said simply. "Sit down." "Mr. Ashford, I can't. You can, and you will." He cracked 3 eggs into a bowl with practiced ease. "And call me Richard. Mr. Ashford was my grandfather." Clara sank onto one of the kitchen stools, too shocked and exhausted to argue. She watched as this billionaire, this man who probably had personal chefs in every home he owned, whisked eggs and heated butter in a pan with the confidence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking food, and her stomach growled audibly. "I learned to cook from my grandmother," Richard said, as if she'd asked. "After my parents died when I was 12, she raised me. We didn't have much. She cleaned houses for a living, took in sewing at night. But she always made sure I had a hot breakfast before school." He poured the eggs into the pan, added herbs, and began to fold them gently. "She used to say you could tell everything about a person by whether they'd share their last meal with a stranger." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry about your parents. It was a long time ago." He slid a perfect omelet onto a plate, added toast from the warmer, and set it in front of her. "Eat, please." The food was delicious, buttery and herb-infused and warm. Clara tried to eat slowly to maintain some dignity, but she was so hungry that she couldn't help herself. Richard watched her for a moment, then began making another omelet for himself. When he sat down across from her, his expression was thoughtful. "Tell me about your family," he said, and somehow, in that quiet kitchen with rain still falling outside, Clara found herself telling him everything. About Daniel's accident at the construction site, the shattered vertebrae that meant he'd never work again. About Emma's diabetes, the constant worry over insulin costs and blood sugar levels. About the medical bills, the overdue rent, the fear that kept her awake every night. She told him about the pride that wouldn't let her ask for help, about the way she smiled through every shift while her world fell apart in slow motion. Richard listened without interrupting, his gray eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, her plate was empty and her cheeks were wet with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. "I have a proposition," Richard said carefully, "and I want you to listen before you say no." Clara wiped her eyes. "I don't want charity." "It's not charity. It's a job." He leaned forward. "I need someone to oversee quality control across my restaurants. Someone who understands what it means to serve people, who notices details, who cares. The position comes with a salary of $90,000 a year, full health benefits, and a company car." Clara's heart stuttered. That was more than she and Daniel had made combined before the accident. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you offer that to me?" "Because I saw you eating cold leftovers and still taking the time to wipe down that counter afterward," Richard said quietly. "Because my grandmother was once in your position, too proud to ask for help, working 3 jobs, going hungry so I could eat. Someone gave her a chance, and it changed both our lives. I've been looking for a way to honor her memory. Maybe this is it." Clara's mind spun. This couldn't be real. People like Richard Ashford didn't rescue struggling waitresses. "I don't have experience in management," she said weakly. "You have something better. You have perspective." He pulled a business card from his pocket and slid it across the counter. "Think about it. Call me tomorrow. If this moment touched your heart, please give the video a thumbs up." Clara picked up the card with trembling fingers. Richard Ashford, CEO, Ashford Restaurant Group. A phone number written in pen on the back. She looked up at him, searching his face for some sign of mockery or pity, but found only sincerity. "Why were you here tonight?" she asked suddenly. "At midnight?" Something flickered in his expression, a shadow of pain quickly hidden. "Sometimes I can't sleep. I come here, go through paperwork, try to quiet my mind." He stood up, collecting their plates. "I watched my grandmother work herself to death, Clara. She was 56 when her heart gave out. I was 23, just starting the business, too young and stupid to realize she needed to slow down. She wouldn't let me help her, wouldn't let anyone help her. Pride. The word came out bitter. By the time I understood what was happening, it was too late." Clara stood up too, her legs unsteady. "I'm not your grandmother." "No," Richard agreed. "But maybe you're a chance at a different ending." He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at her. "Go home to your family, Clara, and tomorrow, call me." After he left, Clara stood in the empty kitchen for a long time, holding that business card like a lifeline, hardly daring to believe that her life might be about to change. But as she finally gathered her coat and prepared to leave, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her purse, lying open on the counter where she'd left it, the envelope of tonight's tips visible inside, and it was empty. Someone had been in the kitchen before Richard arrived. Someone had stolen the $63 she'd made tonight, money she needed desperately for Emma's insulin. Her hope curdled into despair. How could she call Richard tomorrow when she had to figure out how to keep her daughter alive tonight? Clara's hand shook as she checked her purse again, as if the money might magically reappear. $63. Gone. She'd counted it twice before her shift ended, folded it carefully into the envelope with Emma's name written on the outside. Tomorrow was Friday, and Emma's insulin prescription needed to be refilled. Without it, they'd have to start rationing again, a decision that terrified Clara every time she had to make it. She sank back onto the stool, Richard's business card still clutched in one hand. The irony was cruel. An hour ago, she'd been offered a life-changing opportunity, a salary that could solve all their problems. But tomorrow was a lifetime away when your daughter needed medicine today. Clara thought about calling the police. But what could they do? No cameras in the kitchen. No witnesses. It could have been anyone, another server, a dishwasher, even someone off the street who'd slipped in before closing. And involving the police might mean questions she couldn't afford to answer, attention she didn't need. She pulled out her phone and stared at her bank account. $14.37. The insulin cost $80-5. She could ask Daniel's brother for a loan, but they'd borrowed money twice already and hadn't been able to pay it back. She could pawn her mother's ring, but the pawn shops were closed until morning. She could what? What options did she have? Clara's phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Em's asking for you. Are you coming home soon? I love you." The tears came then, hot and furious. She let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes, timed it on her phone like she always did, because if she didn't set a limit, she'd never stop. Then she wiped her face, straightened her shoulders, and made the only decision she could. She'd go to the 24-hour clinic downtown, explain the situation, and beg them for enough insulin to get through the weekend. It was humiliating, but Emma's life was worth any amount of shame. She was halfway to the door when it opened again. Richard stood there, a canvas tote bag in his hand. "Forgot my laptop," he said, then stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" "Nothing. I was just leaving." He set down the bag and walked toward her, his brow furrowed. "Clara, what happened?" And maybe it was exhaustion, or fear, or the way he'd cooked for her and listened to her story without judgment. But Clara found herself telling him about the stolen money, about Emma's insulin, about the impossible choice she'd been facing before his job offer had appeared like a miracle she couldn't quite grasp. "My daughter is 11 years old," she said, her voice breaking. "She likes drawing and terrible pop music. She wants to be a veterinarian. And I can't even keep her alive until tomorrow." Richard's expression shifted into something Clara couldn't quite identify: anger. Yes, but not at her. He pulled out his phone. "What pharmacy do you use?" "Mr. Ashford, Richard." "What pharmacy?" "Miller's on 5th Street, but..." He was already dialing. Clara watched, stunned, as he spoke to someone on the other end. "This is Richard Ashford. I need you to fill an insulin prescription and deliver it to." He looked at Clara questioningly. She gave him her address in a whisper, unable to believe what was happening. "Within the hour." "Yes, I'll cover the cost. And anything else the family needs. Have your pharmacist call the customer and get a full list." He ended the call and looked at Clara. "It's done." "I can't accept." "Yes, you can." His voice was firm but kind. "Consider it an advance on your salary. Because you are taking that job, Clara. Not because you need it, though you do, but because my restaurants need you. Because I need someone who understands what hunger feels like, who knows what it means to struggle, who won't forget where they came from. Have you ever faced something like this? A moment when someone's kindness changed everything? Let us know in the comments." Clara's legs gave out. She sank onto the stool again, covering her face with her hands. "Why are you doing this?" Richard sat down beside her, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with old pain. "Because 30 years ago, a restaurant owner found my grandmother eating scraps in an alley behind his establishment. Instead of calling the police, he gave her a job. That job saved our lives. I've spent decades building an empire, Clara, and I've never forgotten where I came from. Maybe it's time I paid that kindness forward." He stood up and headed for the door, then paused. "Get some rest. Come to my office Monday morning at 9. We'll discuss your new position and get you set up with an advance to cover this month's rent and bills." "And Clara?" He turned to look at her one last time. "You didn't fail tonight. You survived. That takes more strength than most people will ever understand." After he left, Clara sat in the silent kitchen, holding her phone, waiting for the pharmacy to call. When it rang, and the pharmacist cheerfully asked what else the family needed, Clara finally let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. Monday morning arrived wrapped in crisp autumn sunshine. Clara stood outside the Ashford building, a gleaming tower of steel and glass in the heart of downtown, and tried to calm her racing heart. She wore her best dress and navy blue number she'd had since before Emma was born, and carried a folder containing the notes she'd made over the weekend about every problem she'd noticed at Romano's and the other Ashford restaurants she'd researched. Online, the insulin had arrived Friday night, just as Richard promised. But he'd done more than that. The delivery had included 3 bags of groceries, A check for $2,000 marked salary advance, and a note in Richard's handwriting, "For Emma. No child should go hungry. See you Monday." Our Daniel had cried when Clara showed him the check. Real, gasping sobs of relief that he'd tried to hide from Emma. They'd paid the landlord Saturday morning. Bought Emma new shoes and the science textbooks she needed for school, and filled their pantry for the first time in months. That night, the three of them had eaten dinner together, actual dinner, with vegetables and protein and enough for everyone, and Clara had watched her family smile in a way she hadn't seen in nearly a year. Now, as she rode the elevator to the 23rd floor, Clara's mind raced with anxiety. What if Richard had changed his mind? What if he'd realized his generosity was a mistake? What if she couldn't do this job, couldn't meet his expectations? The elevator doors opened onto a reception area so elegant it made Clara's breath catch. A young woman in a headset looked up and smiled. "Ms. Martinez? Mr. Ashford is expecting you. Right this way." Richard's office overlooked the city, floor-to-ceiling windows framing the skyline like a photograph. He stood when Clara entered, wearing dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking somehow more approachable than he had in his suit. "Clara, welcome. Coffee?" They spent the next hour discussing her new role. Richard wanted her to visit each restaurant, eat as a customer, observe the staff, and report back on everything from food quality to how the servers treated difficult guests. He wanted honesty, he said, not flattery. He wanted someone who would tell him the truth about what was working and what wasn't. "You'll start with Romano's since you know it best," Richard explained, pulling up schedules on his computer. "But eventually, you'll travel. I know that might be difficult with Emma. I can make it work," Clara said quickly, and meant it. For this salary, for this opportunity, she'd find a way. Richard smiled. "Actually, I have a suggestion about that." He handed her a benefits package, and Clara's eyes widened as she read. Full health insurance with no deductible, dental, vision, and a child care stipend. "I remember what it was like growing up with a working single parent," Richard said quietly. "I spent a lot of afternoons alone, doing homework at whatever restaurant or office my grandmother was cleaning. Emma shouldn't have to do that." Clara's eyes filled with tears for what felt like the 100th time in 3 days. "I don't know how to thank you. Do good work. That's all the thanks I need." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city. "I should tell you something, though. Something I haven't told many people." Clara waited, sensing this was important. "The night I found you in the kitchen," Richard said slowly, "I hadn't gone there to check on paperwork. I'd gone there to say goodbye." He turned to face her, his expression vulnerable. "I've been battling depression for years. Building this empire, proving I could succeed beyond my grandmother's dreams, none of it filled the emptiness inside. That night, I decided I was done. I was going to go up to my office and end it." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "But then I saw you," Richard continued, his voice rough. "Standing there eating cold leftovers, crying, but still making sure to clean up after yourself. Still showing dignity and care even in your lowest moment. And I thought about my grandmother, about all the nights she must have done the same thing. I thought about how she never gave up, even when she had every reason to." He paused, swallowing hard. "You saved my life that night, Clara, not the other way around. You reminded me why any of this matters." If you've been enjoying this story, subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Clara stood up and crossed to where Richard stood. She didn't touch him, that felt too presumptuous, but she looked him straight in the eye. "Then we saved each other," she said softly, "because I was drowning that night and you threw me a rope." Richard nodded, seeming unable to speak for a moment. When he did, his voice was stronger. "Let's both keep swimming then. Deal?" "Deal. They shook hands, and Clara felt the weight of it, not just a business arrangement, but a promise. Two people who'd been broken, helping each other become whole. As Clara left the office that morning with her new company laptop and a heart full of hope, she had no idea that the real challenge was just beginning, or that the friendship forming between her and Richard would change not just their lives, but the lives of hundreds of others in ways neither of them could yet imagine. 6 months later, Clara stood in the kitchen of Romano's with Richard at her side, watching as Paulo trained a new hire. But this wasn't just any new hire. Miguel was a formerly homeless veteran whom Clara had found eating from the dumpster behind the restaurant 3 months ago. Instead of calling security, she'd remembered a rainy Thursday night and a billionaire who'd chosen kindness. Now Miguel was learning to cook, earning a living wage, and sleeping in an apartment that Ashford Restaurant Group helped subsidize. He was the 7th person Clara had brought into the program. She'd convinced Richard to start second servings, they called it. Each Ashford restaurant now employed at least one person who'd been homeless, formerly incarcerated, or otherwise struggling to find work. The program included job training, mental health support, and financial literacy classes. And it was working. Turnover had decreased, customer satisfaction had increased, and the staff at every location seemed happier, more invested. "You know what the board said when I proposed this?" Richard murmured, watching Miguel carefully dice vegetables under Paulo's patient instruction. "They said it was a liability, that it would damage the brand." Clara smiled. "What did you tell them?" "That the brand is only as strong as the people who build it, and that my grandmother taught me we're all one bad day away from needing help." He glanced at her. "You've changed everything, Clara, not just the restaurants, me." It was true. Richard had started therapy, was sleeping better, smiled more often. He'd even begun dating a kind-hearted librarian named Patricia who didn't care about his money and made him laugh. Clara had met her twice now and approved wholeheartedly. And Clara herself had changed too. She'd gained weight, the healthy kind, from eating regular meals. The shadows under her eyes had faded. Emma's diabetes was under control. Daniel was working part-time as a consultant from home, and they'd moved to a bigger apartment where Emma finally had her own room. But more than that, Clara had discovered something about herself. She was good at this. Really good. She had an eye for talent, an instinct for problem-solving, and a way of talking to struggling people that made them believe in themselves again. "I have something to tell you," Richard said now, leading her out of the kitchen to his office in the back. "I've been talking to some other restaurant owners, friends of mine who've seen what we're doing. They want to implement similar programs." Clara's eyes widened. "That's wonderful." "It is. And they want you to help them do it." Richard pulled out a folder, slid it across the desk. "I've been offered a position on several boards of directors, and they're asking me to bring you along as a consultant. It would mean more travel, but also more money. And more importantly, a chance to spread this program across the country." Clara opened the folder, scanning the details. The salary figure made her dizzy. "Richard, I've only been doing this for 6 months. And in 6 months, you've transformed my company and saved my life. I'd say you're qualified." He leaned forward. "You told me once that Emma wants to be a veterinarian. This salary would pay for her college. All 4 years. And Daniel's medical expenses. And a house if you want one." Clara sat down heavily. "I need to think about it. Talk to Daniel." "Of course. Take your time." Richard smiled. "But Clara, whatever you decide, know that you've already succeeded. You took a terrible moment and turned it into something beautiful. That's not luck. That's character." That evening, Clara sat at her kitchen table with Daniel and Emma, talking about the future. Emma was excited about the possibility of her mom traveling, of seeing new places through her mother's stories. Daniel was proud, beaming in that way he had when he looked at her lately, like he was seeing her for the first time all over again. "You should do it," Daniel said, taking her hand. "You've spent so long taking care of us. Let us take care of you for a change. Let us be proud of you." "I'm already proud of Mom," Emma piped up through a mouthful of dinner. "She's like a superhero, but with better hair." They all laughed, and Clara felt something settle in her chest, a certainty that had been building for months. This was right. All of it. The job, the program, the future spreading out before them like a map of possibilities. 3 weeks later, at a celebration dinner for Second Serving's first anniversary, Richard raised his glass in a toast. "To my grandmother, who taught me that kindness isn't weakness. And to Clara Martinez, who reminded me that sometimes the best business decisions are the ones made with your heart." Clara raised her own glass. Looking around at the room full of staff members whose lives had been changed, board members who'd learned to see value in unexpected places, and her own family, healthy and whole and happy. "To second chances," she said softly, "and to the people brave enough to give them." As they drank, Clara caught Richard's eye across the table. He nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. Two broken people who'd found each other on the worst night of their lives and built something beautiful from the wreckage. Outside, rain had started to fall, gentle and cleansing. But inside, the restaurant glowed with warmth and light and the sound of people who'd learned that sometimes the most valuable thing you can offer someone is the same thing you once needed yourself. Hope, if you enjoyed this story, please remember to leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales of kindness and second chances. Thank you for sharing this journey with us, and may you always remember, we're all just one act of compassion away from changing someone's life forever. God bless.